Nice to be able to connect with everybody, even virtually. As Allison mentioned, I taught at the University of Chicago Northwestern and now part of Carnegie. I have a PhD from Carnegie Mellon, and I'm a big fan of the school and have been participating in a social enterprise prize. Uh, Sorry, my voice is changing a little. Um, and you'll hear more about it. I'd love anybody that's an undergraduate or MBA student that's interested in social enterprise, and you can think of nonprofit as well as social enterprise, and would like to participate. We'd love to have you. So with that, I've got a lot to cover today. I'm gonna talk about two topics. I'm actually going to really cover one called understanding the customer, and I'll go through that in a minute. There's also a second set of slides associated with something called the USP, unique selling proposition. And what that means is that what is the reason that you want to buy my product? How do I stand out versus competition? Well, I won't cover it today, but there's a set of slides, two videos that are associated with it that I've created, and then last year's presentation on it that Allison will make available to you. Now, I'm going to focus much more right now on understanding the customer. Let me just go through quickly what the objectives are that I'm going to cover. First, why is it critical to understand the customer? You may think it's obvious, but I'll come back to that. Secondly, who is your customer? How does the market segment? So in marketing, and last year I did some presentations on market segmentation, or what we talked about at Northwestern. When I taught at Northwestern, we called it STP, segmentation, targeting, and positioning. And there is also a lecture on that that probably is available through last year's Connects presentations. Some simple tools for how to research your customers. Big companies like Procter & Gamble or American Express spend huge sums of money studying their customer. They've got big research budgets. As an entrepreneur, you don't have it. So I've laid out, and you'll see in an appendix to this presentation, a whole set of steps that you can follow to do low-cost customer research, which I view as critical, and I'll come back to that later. I'm going to talk about once you do customer research, once you think you understand the customer, how do you assess whether your understanding is accurate? And so I'm going to talk about baselines, which is really a key concept to me in the way you try to assess are your research findings sensible, reasonable? Is your thought process about your new product sensible? And then lastly, talk about decision biases, and I'm going to do that very quickly. But there's a tendency among entrepreneurs to do something called have a confirmatory bias, which means that I only look at information that confirms my point of view. I don't look at information that contradicts my point of view about why my product is going to be successful. And biases are a critical problem. Decision biases are a critical problem that entrepreneurs face. So let me move forward and talk about why is it so important to understand your customer. I'm going to cover the second point. Without clarity on your customer, you're essentially building a product or marketing strategy in the dark. And when I taught a class with Dave Mawhinney, and he's now teaching it called Marketing for Entrepreneurs. And I did a lot of videos for it. And one of the concepts that I did in one of the videos was build it and they will come. And the idea is, well, I've got a product idea. I'm sure customers will love it. I talked to a friend of mine, he thinks it's great, and now suddenly I'm going to have a successful product. In general, you're building your product and your marketing strategy in the dark, and that is not the way you want to think about it. So here's why it matters. Here's what it impacts. First, product market fit, or what I really talk about in my terminology is USP. Your product or service only succeeds if you solve a real world problem that people care about. And if you don't know your customer, you risk building a product or service with features that nobody values. And I'm not going to do it today, but I also talk about benefits. What benefits the consumer? So if you don't understand the customer, you don't understand the consumer, you're not in the position to really build a successful product. Clear value proposition. Understanding the customer's pain points and goals lets you articulate why they should choose you over your alternative. The question you should ask yourself almost every day when you're an entrepreneur is, why are they going to buy my product? And being a Me Too product, having a product that's equivalent to other people isn't enough. And in the nomenclature that people use in entrepreneurship, I have to have a goodness of fit better than the competition 10 times. And I think that's probably a little overstated, but I have to be significantly better than the competition. Me Too does not make you successful. And you've got to understand, does the customer see the difference between your product and the competition? Do they really recognize that you are superior and you're solving a real problem? Designing your marketing strategy. You can't reach everybody. And I'm going to talk briefly about segmentation, which is a key concept in marketing. When you know who your target customer, you can pick the right channels, meaning what social media you use, what kinds of trade shows and referrals you're using. How do you communicate with the customer, and avoid burning a lot of cash on broad, ineffective marketing programs. And one of the problems that entrepreneurs face is that they raise money and immediately they want to rush out and use social media. They don't understand who they're targeting. They don't understand why the customer wants to buy my product, et cetera. Understanding the customer is critical. Two quick examples, and indirectly, you've already heard the first one. Bad approach. Our product is for everyone who uses the internet. Too broad, impossible to target. Better approach. Our product is for independent fitness trainers aged 25 to 40 who struggle to manage client scheduling and payments. Clear customer, clear problem, easy to market, easy to design the features. So you got to ask yourself, are you taking the bad approach or the good approach when you're thinking about your product or service and how you're going to market it? So in short, for entrepreneurs, customers are the business. They define what you build, how you market, how you sell, how you price, and how you grow. And without a sharp understanding of them, even the best ideas fail. So let me get to another critical concept, and not something that you really see much in the way of marketing book in marketing books. They do talk about something called the channels of distribution, but I'm going to call it the customer chain. And the customer chain looks like this. The customer is more complex than the end user. So I'm going to give an example, and then I'll put up the chart. I had somebody come to me, two women who came to me with an idea they had called their hangover remedy. And the idea was that they had created a gummy which allowed you to chew this gummy before you go to the bar or wherever you're going to drink, a party, and it'll decrease the chances of hangover. So I remember my undergrad or my graduate days at Carnegie, and that was a real issue. Now, the question is, and as you think about this, who is the customer? Who am I marketing this to? So here's some answers or potentials. One is retailers like chain drugstores. So you're going to go to a party, you pass a Walgreens or a CVS, and you say, you know, I ought to go in there and buy those gummies. I might feel a lot better tomorrow. Another is you're sitting in a bar, and the bartender, you turn to him and say, would you happen to have those gummies? And the bartender says, oh, yes, it's a great product. It'll help you tomorrow. Or alternative, you could go direct to the end user. So as we go through this, you'll see that the customer isn't just the end user, but there are also key intermediaries who are affecting this or who could have a big impact on your ability to sell. And the most obvious intermediary is something like a retailer. So I call this the customer chain, and it can be even more complicated. And I'll come back to it in a second. You start out with a firm, you or the entrepreneur. You have intermediaries. One could be a retailer. I used a bar as an example, but it could be other intermediaries. And I'll come back to that in a second. And then you have the end user. And one of the issues that you have to decide and understand is, if I'm selling a product or a service through an intermediary as well as an end user, I'm selling it to the end user, but I have to sell it through an intermediary, I better understand that intermediary. So the big consumer packaged goods companies like Procter & Gamble have huge teams of people who study and understand the retailer. I'm marketing a product, and if I want to try to sell it through Costco, I better understand how Costco evaluates my product. It may be a good product to the end user, but Costco could stop the sale of my product because they don't see any real benefit to them. I'm not making as high margin as I am on another product. The product is difficult to get serviced, whatever the reason is. So intermediaries are just as important in many products as end users. In marketing and in business, we talk about B2B, business to business marketing. In that, you're selling to a large corporation. You may be selling computer services, or you've got an AI idea and you want to sell it to a corporation. You may think that the customer is the person that's actually going to use the product, but there may be a number of intermediaries in that organization that are going to influence your ability to sell it. It may be a purchasing agent. It may be the chief financial officer. So intermediary doesn't just automatically mean a retailer. It could be multiple people in the organization who impact or affect the sale of or the purchase of a product. So I want you to walk away and really understand the customer chain. This is really an important idea. Now, I'm going to give a nonprofit example for you in a second. So I was the chairman of the board of a charity in Carbondale, Colorado. It's near Aspen, called Youth Entity. And Youth Entity, the two largest services or products that they offer are financial literacy, which I helped start, and a whole program aimed at high school kids and elementary students in financial literacy. And we have about 6,500 students in the western part of Colorado that participate in this. But the CEO or chairman, executive director of Youth Entity created a career academy. And the idea was that a lot of students, and now it's becoming very popular to talk about this, a lot of students shouldn't necessarily go to college. College is not really going to prepare them for careers, and they're not really particularly interested in going to college. And the idea was to have careers in a number of areas, the trades, meaning things like electricians and plumbers, culinary, which was focused on restaurants, veterinary assistants, and a number of other areas. And so how do we start getting students, young students, high school students, prepared to go into those kinds of careers? And so it sounds like a great idea. Customer chain. Here's what the issue was. Who is the customer? Now, if this were a class, I'd turn to you and I'd make you give me your hypotheses about what it is. This is what they found out. Number one was the high school bureaucracy. That's what I call it. Teacher, parents, and students as well. But the bureaucracy is really the administrators in the schools. And the administrators in the school have a huge impact on what's going to be taught. Now, the teachers may be interested in it, but the bureaucracy can block it. Now, you may think that what we're really targeting is the end user, which is the students, but parents also have a big impact on this. So when we think about the customer chain, it's the school bureaucracy, it's the teachers. So the bureaucracy says, let's offer it. The teachers go, I'm not interested. It dies. The teachers say, I'm interested. The parents say, well, Johnny and Sally are off doing sports. They don't have time for going to the career academy. So suddenly they block it. And then the students say, I don't have any interest in it. So as you see, it's easy to talk about an idea where it's really, when you go out and you research and you ask people, do you think a career academy is a great idea? Everybody says yes. Marketing it and getting it into the system was extremely difficult. Here's the outcome. Initially, it was critical to get the bureaucracy to allow the courses to be offered. Parents also thought it was important and have strong points of view. It took approximately 3 years before the first course was taught and another 2 years before class sizes became large enough to justify. One of the strange and interesting outcomes of this was the first year that they offered the trade program, which was to become an electrician or a plumber or whatever, only had 2 students. They were both women, which I don't think any of us would have anticipated. Anyway, it has become successful, but it took a long time. It took a long time getting it into the school systems. And the woman who was the executive director was in sales at Dow Chemical and BASF, and really did have an understanding of how you have to market a product like this or a service. Segmentation. This is a cornerstone idea in marketing. As I said, when I taught at Northwestern, we talked about STP, segmentation, targeting, and positioning. And the idea is, and I think intuitively you all understand this, segmentation is all about that there isn't just one single customer. There are different groups of customers that have shared characteristics in some form. And I'm going to go through some examples of this. The auto industry is a very simple example. Vehicles are aimed at different segments: sports cars, SUVs, trucks, passenger cars, minivans. Minivans are dying out. Who was the target for a minivan? It was a family, usually a woman, who was taking the kids all over the place. And it was very easy to put 6 kids in the back or 4 kids in the back of a minivan. If the mother was lucky, she had some kind of a screen so that she didn't have to listen to the kids. And the result was it was a very successful introduction by Chrysler many years ago. It's dying out. Why? Because SUVs have taken over, and SUVs seem to have a broader appeal because they're not only just to drive the kids around, but they also can be used for other purposes. Sports car. You think a sports car customer is exactly the same as a minivan customer? What about trucks? So you out here in Colorado, there's a tremendous amount of people that work on the trades. You drive on the highways and everybody's got a truck. All right. Different segments, different vehicles, and it may be for the same household. He works in the trades, she works in a bank, and they need different kinds of vehicles, and they have kids. So two different vehicles, same household. Here are the different kinds of segmentations, and I've gone through 5 of them for you. Demographic segmentation. This is the easiest one. It's based on observable characteristics such as age, gender, income, etc. If you turn on, I don't know whether you all watch, you probably don't, something like CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News. If you turn those stations on, and they're allegedly news stations, and you watch them, what you see is that about 50% of the ads are for pharmaceuticals. Why is that? Because they know that an older audience, something like Fox skews at 58 or 60 years old in terms of their average audience. And the result is that, of course, they need a lot more pharmaceutical products, and particularly prescription drugs. So that's a very simple example, but you can think about income as another variable, and you're targeting very high income people, and you have a specific type of financial service. So if you look at financial services, particularly brokerage type services, they target high income people. Why? Because that's where they can make money. So demographic segmentation is very simple to understand. The next is geographic segmentation. Certain kinds of products appeal in different kinds of climates, local culture, etc. So you can even think about geographical segmentation. You can open a restaurant, and there, geographical segmentation becomes very important because you have to figure out what area of the city or region your restaurant will appeal to. So you want to offer a high-end restaurant with Asian food and a specific type of Asian food. You have to decide what are the best locations for that. Geographic segmentation becomes very important. Obviously, demographic segmentation is related, but so does geographic segmentation. But geographic segmentation could be different parts of, for example, the US. It could be by type of country. So it's probably easier to think about and used a little less than something like demographic segmentation. The next is something called psychographic segmentation, and that means psychological aspects of consumer behavior, lifestyles, interests, attitudes. So if Substack has become very popular as a vehicle for certain kinds of blogs, and there it depends upon your political affiliation, your attitudes about politics, and so on, and then you'll select specific people on Substack that match those kinds of psychological and attitudinal factors that you think about. When you think about certain kinds of products, automobiles is a good example. Psychographics is very important. When you watch the ads for automobiles, there is a lot of implicit targeting of people with different kinds of psychographics, particularly lifestyles. And so psychographic segmentation is something that advertising agencies, for example, spend a lot of time on. The next one is behavioral segmentation. This has become very popular in internet targeting and so on. And so looking at what kind of purchase habits, brand loyalty, product usage rates people have, but also media usage is become really critical. And we are all inundated with all kinds of communications linked to that. And then the last one is benefit segmentation, something I'm very uh, focused on, and that is focuses on different benefits a product or service offers. Um, the the probably the creator of this, it may not be exactly right, was Procter and Gamble. And their advertising was very clever and their product design was very clever. So if you look at detergents and you ask yourself, different kinds of detergents, now this will be an old example. They had Tide, which was an all-purpose. They had, I'm sorry, it was focused on washing power. They had a product, Cheer, which was aimed at uh, people that were worried about color saturation in terms of the use of detergents. And then they could also have a whitening detergent. And so those are different benefits. You have different use occasions. It could be the same customer seeking different kinds of benefits. An old example that I used to use quite often was M&M's, the candy, and it had a sugar coating. And so it didn't melt in your hand. That was the advertising campaign for it. But the benefit was it didn't melt. And so back before air conditioning, and I know this is probably a little before your time, before air conditioning, this was a big issue in the candy business. And so they came up with M&Ms, and then you could just pop M&Ms in your mouth, keep them in your pocket or in the package, and it wouldn't melt. That's a benefit. And something I'm not going to cover, but you need to learn about is the difference between benefits and features. A benefit is what the customer wants, not necessarily the feature. The feature could be the computer runs faster. I have a more powerful CPU. The benefit is it processes and allows me to get on the web, play games, etc., and doesn't slow down the game. So the benefit is different than the feature. Engineers love features. Marketers love benefits. So it's worth spending a little time. And in the lecture on USP, you'll see that I cover that. Now, one of the questions is, how do I do research? So I'm emphasizing how important it is to understand the customer. Let me just go back and emphasize this again. I through Dave and teaching at Tepper, as well as in other things I used to do, as well as being at Northwestern. So lots of people came to me with product ideas. I would say the number one failure point was lack of understanding the customer. I serve on the board. I served on the board of the Asthma Community Foundation. We received something like 50 to 60 proposals a year from nonprofits. I serve on the board of something in Sarasota, Florida, where I live now, with the Bank of America, where we see lots of proposals to give money. I would say that out of 100 proposals that I see, 5 maybe have any focus on the customer, the client, whoever's being served. It is a major failure. Why is that? It's difficult to learn about the customer. And as I said, the customer is complex. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just very briefly go through 6 different approaches to learning about the customer. I have an appendix to this presentation which goes through in much more detail how to do it. And I strongly emphasize it. Now, last year I started, and it's going to happen again this year, and other people are participating, the Social Enterprise Prize. So I viewed and looked at a lot of proposals. When I looked at the proposals, I consistently saw a lack of understanding the customer. So I can't emphasize this enough. Now, other people may have different points of view. I know it's very important to figure out how to finance a product. I know it's very important to learn how to produce a product or service. And you get very focused on that. Do I have the right people working with me? How am I going to raise the money? If you don't understand the customer, all the things I've covered before start to creep in. I don't know who to target. I'm wasting money on terms of my product design, etc. So low-cost customer research is essential for you. What research methods should you use? So one of the problems that you face when you open up a marketing research text, you'll see a lot of approaches that cost a lot of money. They emphasize trying to reduce the bias in your research and so on. I'll come back to that. I agree with that, but it's very expensive to conduct very good, high quality research. And so the trick is, what kind of methods can I use to avoid that? How do you avoid biases in your results? One of the simple methods that you can use is contact friends and family and ask them the idea. What's the problem with that? Biases, they may not represent the target market, and so on. So how do I avoid it? I'm going to come back to that because there are some ways you can do it that aren't expensive. How do I avoid superficial view of customers? This requires really in-depth understanding of the customers. One of the things that you'll find is when you're asking people, I've got this product idea. I have a remedy for hangovers. What do you think? Oh God, that's one of the big issues. I love to go to parties. I drink too much. I wake up the next day, I feel terrible. I got to go to class. I've got to go to work, etc. Great idea. Are they going to buy it? That's a different question. Where am I going to get it? Am I really going to, before I go out and drink, am I going to say, I needed to? So you got to understand in depth, not just a superficial point of view, which is what I gave you. How does the process work? Where am I going to get it? How am I going to use it? When am I going to use it? Maybe I try it once and then I go, it didn't seem to make enough difference. You got to give it to people and get them to test it. So try to avoid a superficial understanding of the customer. So here's some of the ways to do it. Talk directly to consumers, observe consumer behavior. So one of the things to do is, I actually created something called the virtual store. It was done a little too early. The technology didn't catch up. The technology has caught up, but when I did it, the reason was to really watch people shop in a somewhat artificial environment, but to learn how are they thinking about how do I buy X, how do I buy Y? So observing consumer behavior, observing what people do, and asking people what they do is important. Tap existing free data. You all are experts on tapping the web. There's more and more data. ChatGPT and variants on that are all providing you all kinds of information today that when I was doing a lot of this type of work, I didn't have. Quick and cheap surveys. There are a lot of survey tools out. You'll read them in the appendix, but quick and cheap surveys where you can get 100 people for not very much money. Test in the real world. If you've been spending time going through courses on entrepreneurship, one of the most important words in your vocabulary should be pivot. And I'm sure Dave, when we taught, he gave a lot of examples. I gave a lot of examples. You start out with a hangover remedy and you realize this problem, that problem, and you change how you're either going to market with it, who you're offering it to, et cetera. And so trying to come up with low-cost prototyping methods is very important. And then last, build a feedback loop. Even after you've introduced it, you may need to be able to constantly modify A, how you're marketing it, B, how you're, what the benefits you're offering, et cetera. So as I said, there's an appendix that goes through a lot more detail on this in these lecture notes. The next is something that I'm a big fan of called baselines. I was reading a book about Kahneman and Tversky, and you may not know who they are, but they're two people that won the Nobel Prize in economics for their work on cognitive biases. But one of them was talking about the importance of baselines, which I can't emphasize enough. And I'll come through and I'll talk about why and some examples. Baseline is the average level of a variable that can be used to benchmark results. Why is that important? Because if you do consumer research, if you have a hypothesis about how many people will buy my product, how big the market is, et cetera, I need to benchmark that. A lot of it's opinion, and benchmarking, as I'll show you two examples, is important. You're considering a new restaurant concept. So I had a friend doing this, and you've conducted consumer research among friends. They all go, this is a great idea. We love it. This is going to be a great success, et cetera. And you think your restaurant has about an 80% chance of succeeding. What do you think the baseline success rate for a restaurant is? I'll put it up for you, 10%. Now, this is the problem. This is a critical issue for entrepreneurs. You think you have an 80% chance of success. I've got a better idea than anybody else. 10% chance of success. So I'm an investor. Do I put money into your business? Would I ever invest in a restaurant? The answer is absolutely yes. I once made that mistake, and I will never, ever make that mistake again. Sounded like a great idea. Luckily, it didn't take much money. It was an interesting idea. If I had had the number 10% when I knew this, the answer is I never would have invested in it. And the answer is a baseline. Now, you may want to adjust that and say, well, I think I have better than average chance. Is that 20%? To me, that's 20% is doubling the baseline success rate. Why is it so difficult to develop a restaurant? It is very difficult to manage the labor. It's very difficult to manage the supply. When I was in college, I was a student at Northwestern. I paid my college education. One of the ways I did it was I ran a kitchen, I lived in a fraternity house. I could get room and board free if I ran the kitchen. I had to go out and buy all the products. I had to manage the labor force, et cetera. When you do that, you realize how difficult it is. Every supplier was cheating me. I'm a young kid. I'm 18, 16 years old, 20 years old. I'm 20 years old, I guess. And I'm sitting there, and these guys are walking in, they're 45 years old, and they go, this young kid doesn't know anything. What they didn't know was the other job I had was working in a grocery store. And so I knew the product prices. I knew what meat was. I knew what produce was, et cetera. And so that gave me an advantage. But even so, it is very difficult to manage. So the answer is going from 10% to 20% is a pretty big jump. Do you think that that's a reasonable number? That's the question. All right. I'll give you one other example, but I'm going to move on. Um, your customer score satisfaction is 65% good or bad. Here's what the average is 75% to 85%. You're below average in customer satisfaction. So when you get back customer satisfaction results, you have to benchmark it to know, are you good or bad? Last example, real fast, baseball. If somebody bats 300 and 310 this year, are they a good or bad baseball player? That's 30% of the time you get a hit. The answer is in baseball, that's very good because the baseline might be 250 to 260. So what you have to understand is what's the baseline that gives you an idea of are you good, bad, or average? The last thing I'm going to talk about, and then we'll stop and I'll open it up for questions, is decision biases. Decision-making biases are a clear and serious problem in learning and interpreting information about customers. Entrepreneurs are often overconfident in their knowledge and belief about their on their perspectives about customers, and they often look for evidence that's confirming their biases. There is a terrific book that was written by a Wharton professor, or a University of Penn professor, called Super Forecasters, and it's very interesting what he learned. What he learned, so he studied these people who were very, very effective at forecasting. And he had all kinds of tests, et cetera. And he'd find people that did well and didn't do well, and he'd retest them and so on. One of the things that he learned about super forecasters was they spent a lot of time trying to find disconfirming evidence. What does that mean? I'm going to start a restaurant. I think I've got a great concept. What are all the reasons that this would fail? A, B, C. Are the number of reasons that are going to fail greater or so overwhelming relative to success? Do I think that I can manage the suppliers? Do I think I can manage the labor? Do I think I can get a good location in a reasonable lease? And so on. All the reasons on the negative side are worth paying attention. Entrepreneurs often fail at that. All they do is spend time looking for what I'll call confirmatory bias or other people. So I've already covered this example. Confirmatory bias. Looking for information that supports a particular decision. I was on the board of a number of corporations. I've served on nonprofit boards and so on. I would say number one on all the biases that I see, it's this one. And I've covered it with you. Optimism bias. overestimating the likelihood of positive events. Sunk cost bias, and if you're in the business school, you probably learned about this. They refer to it as unwillingness to admit you're wrong. But the problem is you've made an investment, you've spent $100,000 or whatever. It's not working. Do you pour money into it, more money into it or not? The 100,000 is sunk. You can never make it back. The question is, in the next X dollars, let's say $50,000, is it a better bet than I had when I made my initial investment or not? Sunk costs is really a problem. It's a psychological problem. Economics, accounting, they know this, but it's very difficult to get past it psychologically. Anchoring bias, anchoring oneself in an initial piece of information, not recognizing that there's so much other information available. Overconfidence bias, overestimating the ability to predict or foresee future events. So why are these so important for you to understand? The reason is very simple. If you have this overconfidence, if you have confirmatory bias, et cetera, and there are a lot more, I didn't put them in. It's easy to just pull up the web and look at these. You've got to understand that this is a big issue. You want to believe in your product or service. You want to believe you're going to be successful. That causes the temptation to have all of these kinds of biases in terms of what's going to affect whether you're rationally and objectively looking at what your odds are, where you're making mistakes, and so on. So in summary, the key concepts I've covered, the importance of understanding the customer, as I said, I would say that this is one of the three major sources of failures of entrepreneurial organizations. The customer chain. The customer is not as simple as just understanding the end user, which isn't even simple to understand. There are lots of potential intermediaries. You may have to be selling to an intermediary and understanding that intermediary as well as understanding the end user. There was an example that we had in our class one time that Dave and I taught about a produce product. It was crisper, better than the existing kinds of produce products that you could buy. The retailer couldn't see that they could make enough money on it. The turn rate, in other words, how fast you sold it, wasn't fast enough, et cetera. That caused it to fail. It wasn't that the end user didn't like the product better. It was that the intermediary didn't see an economic advantage in selling it. Segmentation, STP, segmentation, targeting, and positioning. First, you have to segment the market, and then you have to target. Who are you going to go after? The universe of people isn't interesting. Going back to the example that I gave about a trainer targeting people that are 25 to 45 with specific demographic or psychographic characteristics, suddenly that kind of targeting makes it a lot easier to recognize who you can reach in terms of communication vehicles, where you may have to advertise, et cetera. Low-cost methods of conducting consumer research. I want to emphasize low cost because I understand how difficult it is. Entrepreneurs don't have a lot of money. So how do you do it? Baselines, trying to figure out what's the average that I'm likely to see. And then lastly, the kinds of biases I may see that may affect my ability to look at objectively what's going on with my product. And that gets into the word pivoting. Good objective view of your business may cause you to pivot. And a lot of times the pivot makes the business successful. All right, so with that, I'll open it up to questions for you and answer anything that you may have. And I'll end the show. You have these slides. As I said, I mentioned the USP. You can look through that. It's a very important concept and something that I used to do a lot of consulting to one of the big advertising agencies in Chicago when I was in Chicago. And I learned this idea. It's a very powerful concept. And so you'll see two videos, lecture notes, and last year's lecture on it. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
We have a question, Bob, from in person.
And in person.
Hey, thanks so much for the chat. I'm curious specifically how you would talk about metrics as to when to pivot. Because I know, like, obviously you have all that self-belief as an entrepreneur, but then you have to be objective, like you're talking about. And it's hard because I think also sometimes there's just a little more perseverance required and then you can break through. But also that's a trap and you need to pivot. So, like, how do you think about when to decide to pivot?
So I'll give you two parts to it. The marketing answer is that you're constantly, so you introduce the product or you're doing enough consumer research to see that while you have some success, there are a lot of negatives in terms of what the customers are saying. They may not say it initially, but this is where in-depth research becomes really important. You've got to get out there and really start talking to people, getting past their initial, I don't know you, but you seem like a nice guy. This really does sound like an interesting product. After they say that, you got to really delve into it. So doing some kind of in-depth understanding of the customer and why they may or may not, why this product may not be successful. And then the second, and I'm going to state the obvious, is financial. Can you sustain and can you get people who are willing to invest and help you sustain this kind of business? And that may force you to either pivot or close. I'm a fan of pivoting because I think uh, I'll give my wife as an example. She owned an art gallery for a long time and recognized that it was a very expensive business to run. Of course, I was the one that was explaining that to her. And she became a private art dealer. It was a much more successful venture but if she hadn't done the first part, she wouldn't have developed a reputation that allowed her to become a private art dealer. So she pivoted and that helped her. Um, and there are a lot of examples, but it's a very difficult question. I would emphasize constantly going back and understanding the customer, not because I'm a marketing professor, but because I think that's really the critical. Is there enough information being provided that's going to cause you to want to continue, that there's a ray of hope here? And if I make these changes, I can succeed. But this goes back to cognitive biases. You got to be very careful that you're objective in trying to evaluate that.
Okay, great. Thank you.